Pope Benedict haven't been invited. So indeed, he was invited, and he sent a small note saying, thanking for the invitation, and then saying, he'll keep the whole event in his heart and wish everybody well, for coming for this event. We're not sure about the extent of frailty of his body, so we decided to, some of you had a chance, the speakers had a chance to sign a small card. It will accompany a scarf that we shall send to him and another one to Pope Francis. So that's how we decided to deal with the issue. As you come, there's quite a bit of attrition or hemorrhage of participation and participant. If there's some more coming, but we'll probably continue while the rest do come. I think for the afternoon session, Father Nicola Riccardi is probably accepted to moderate this second session for us. And a te la parola.
Welcome back in this second section. We are less than this morning, and in the 40 key address which opens this second section regarding the perspective of Catholic development agencies, our speakers are Dr. Tony Castleman, Director of Agriculture, Livelihoods, Water and Microfinance at CRS. Dr. Castleman holds a doctorate in economy and extensive international experience as a program supervisor, especially in the East country, like India, Nepal, and others. As a responder, we have Dr. Lawrence Honey, Development Analyst, UCC, Ghana. Dr. Oni is a development economist. In addition to academic assignments at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana, he holds positions in government institutions in Ghana. As a format, we will follow the same structure as it was this morning sections. So speakers will have 20 minutes for their presentations and respondents 10 minutes. At the end of their presentation, there will be a 30 minutes long open discussion. Each intervention will take maximum 5 minutes, and for time reason, we will have no more than 3 of these. Instead, the question will be collected in groups of 3 per time. So now we are moving to the Dr. Tony Castleman for his presentation, please.
Thank you, Father Riccardi. Your Eminence, fathers, sisters, colleagues, and friends, I'm honored to have the opportunity to share with you the approach that Catholic Relief Services takes to development and the efforts we make to operationalize and actualize human dignity and other Catholic social teachings in our development and humanitarian programs. Catholic Relief Services is the overseas relief and development agency of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and a member of the Caritas Internationalis Confederation. We carry out emergency response, health, agriculture, education, and other programs with poor and marginalized populations in over 110 countries. As others have shared, the concept of integral human development was introduced by Pope Paul VI in the 1967 encyclical Popularum Progressio. The vision that underlies integral human development is captured concisely in Pope Benedict XVI's encyclical letter, Caritas in Veritate, that we are reflecting on today. The encyclical states, authentic human development concerns the whole of the person in every single dimension. For CRS, holding integral human development as our overarching framework means we work to help individuals, families, and communities grow and develop in all aspects of their lives not confined to a single sector, and not confined to the material dimensions of their lives only. CRS wrote a guide on integral human development for our teams and partners, and it frames integral human development not only as a goal, but also as a process, and I'll quote from it: "A long-term, dynamic process based on human dignity and right relations. Advancing integral human development means working with a variety of actors to transform the way that societies live, heal, and structure their relationships." Note the emphasis on dignity and relationships. Integral human development requires fostering dignity-enhancing relationships and reducing dignity-diminishing relationships at all levels, within the organization, with our partners, with communities, with community members, and in groups and families. Caritas and Veritate eloquently makes this point by saying, authentic development is not guaranteed by merely technical progress in relationships of utility, but by opening up the path towards reciprocity of consciences and liberties. So how do we translate these goals into programming approaches for the projects that CRS and its partners implement throughout the world? Well, CRS has recently launched a 12-year strategy until 2030 that aspires to catalyze transformational change at scale. We have a set of ambitious people-level impact targets that are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals that Professor Sachs shared with us. The diagram on the screen depicts how our strategy translates integral human development into a strategic framework for our programming. In the human dignity, upholding human dignity is at the center of the diagram because it is the core of our mission, and it underlies and anchors all of our programs. The circle in the center depicts the humanitarian and development content and goals of our programs: saving lives, ending poverty, cultivating just societies. And the outer circle depicts how we carry out this work: promoting local leadership, caring for creation, fostering civic engagement, and ensuring social equity and inclusion. Now, many organizations, as well as donors and governments, implement multi-sectoral approaches and work to strengthen local leadership, social equity, and the other elements that are here. But one of the things that differentiates CRS is our efforts to concretely apply specific principles and values based on Catholic social teachings and incorporate these principles and values into our projects, our systems, and our processes, to concretely apply them into our systems. And this is the experience that I'd like to share with you all today. CRS has a set of 8 guiding principles. These are based on Catholic social teachings. They inspire and underlie our work, but we also take these principles a step further by concretely applying them in specific components of our activities. And there are 3 main reasons why we do this. The first reason is simply to ensure that the principle translates into action. It's common to keep principles like this as part of our vision or inspiration or as a motivating reminder, and that's important. But by also incorporating the principles into project design, into monitoring and evaluation, into human resources and other systems, they become more actionable and meaningful for people's lives. So to take a simple example, option for the poor, which gives weighted concern to the needs of the poorest and the most vulnerable. In our emergency programs, after a disaster strikes, the tools that we use and the processes that we use to target people for relief supplies are designed to identify the poorest, the most vulnerable, those from the lowest socioeconomic status. This helps to operationalize that guiding principle in our emergency programs throughout the world. So the second reason we seek to incorporate the guiding principles into specific activities is to institutionalize the principles in our systems and organizational norms. Often, going from principles and social teachings to action depends on individuals who are particularly oriented towards those principles, and there are other individuals who may be less so. Now, such individuals in any organization or movement are vital, and they often lead the way. But when we institutionalize a principle into specific policies and norms and practices, the core practice remains intact, even in the face of changes in leadership and personnel. And the third reason is so that we can share these approaches and practices with other stakeholders to encourage replication, adaptation, and scaling of values-based programming. And in this way, it's perhaps a small step towards what Professor Sachs was advocating that we do in sharing our social teachings and how to apply them outwardly with the larger world. Now, sharing principles alone can be limited in its effect on practice, but when we offer specific tools, specific project components, specific practices that have demonstrated results, it makes it easier for others to follow those principles, especially because many, many organizations do share similar values. The University of Notre Dame did some research, and they found that 33 leading international development organizations include dignity in their mission or in their vision statement. So this is an important role that Catholic and other faith-based organizations can play in the global development and humanitarian community. We can develop and share specific replicable practices that embody these social teachings and principles. So I want to share some examples of how we incorporate these, but before I do, I just want to mention that one important part of operationalizing these guiding principles is measuring their application and impacts. This morning there was some discussion on metrics and indicators, and those are important ones at the global level, measures of inequality and other types of metrics. What we've been looking at is how we can measure subsidiarity by tracking the advancement of local leadership, or measuring the extent that our programs change how people treat each other, with an emphasis on upholding human dignity. Now, there is a view that measurement of principles like this either isn't possible or that it deadens or makes mundane these things that should remain in the sphere of inspiring values. Our experience has found that measurement is imperfect of these things, but it is still valuable. It holds us accountable to ourselves and to the communities that we serve by showing us the extent to which our programs do advance these principles. It also enables us to see changes related to the principles, including if there are unintended negative impacts. Consider a health program that increases the efficiency and cost effectiveness of care for pregnant women by moving them quickly through the health facility. At the same time, their dignity may be reduced by reducing privacy, limiting interactions with healthcare workers, cramping waiting space. When we measure these aspects of dignity in the health system, we will pay more attention to them. And measuring these principles can also serve as an incentive to help us prioritize them. There's a maxim that what gets measured gets done. And while that's an oversimplification, it is true that in the midst of multiple competing priorities, projects often focus on the things that they measure and that they report on. For example, if we measure social cohesion within communities and other relationships that express solidarity, we're more likely to design our programs in ways that advance cohesion. And lastly, measuring our principles keeps them in our consciousness. If a project team is measuring participants' rights and responsibilities, they need to be asking questions about these rights. And that keeps them present in our minds and in conversations with partners and community members. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each of the guiding principles, but I do want to share a few examples of how we incorporate these into our work. So sacredness and dignity of the human person. This is our first, and I might say our primary principle. Upholding human dignity is at the core of our mission and the foundation of our work. Dignity has multiple interpretations, and the principle clearly points to the specific aspect of human dignity from Catholic social teaching, the inherent value that every human being possesses. Dignity is present in every individual, yet when we don't recognize or value the inherent dignity in others, we have the capacity to diminish or even crush others' dignity through inhumane treatment, violence, abuse, humiliation, many of the things that Professor Sachs shared this morning going on in the world today. Many of the greatest evils that humans commit, genocide, rape, slavery, human trafficking, are rooted in dehumanization, in not seeing or valuing the inherent human dignity in others. Conversely, much of the greatest good that humans do is rooted in actively valuing the inherent dignity in others. One of the greatest contributions of St. Teresa of Calcutta, perhaps her most transformational contribution, was demonstrating through action, through praxis, that every human being is of value and should be treated with decency and even love. No matter how destitute, no matter how many sores are on his body, no matter how many days he has left in this world. In many respects, St. Teresa changed the way the world saw these brothers and sisters, or perhaps more accurately, she helped the world to see them at all. The implication, the responsibility for a society or for a development program is to ensure that our systems, our leaders, our norms promote and uphold human dignity and prevent dehumanization. Dignity is God-given and inherent in every individual. What is in our control are interactions, relationships, behaviors, norms, how we see and treat each other. This entails the concept of encounter, or as Caritas in Veritate teaches us, to see in the other something more than just another creature, to recognize the divine image in the other, thus truly coming to discover him or her and to mature in a love that becomes concern and care for the other. From CRS's side, in our humanitarian and development programs, we try to design projects with specific approaches that foster relationships that respect and value every individual, especially the most marginalized, whose dignity is often trampled upon. For example, in Ghana and India, we supported government health systems to increase respectful care for pregnant women, using specific interventions focused on health workers' interactions with patients and patient consent and privacy. And this is an area where we continue to learn from our local partners. In a refugee project that CRS recently implemented with a diocese partner, we were providing a package of supplies to refugees to help them integrate and remain in their project area. Our donor set a target for the number of refugees to be registered each day, but after a couple weeks, we found that the partner was substantially behind the target. So when we discussed with the diocese partner, we found the reason for this was that they were spending a couple of hours with each refugee family, listening to their story, counseling them, helping connect them to other families. It became clear that this was as or more important to the family's well-being than the package of goods, and that it was contributing to the project's objectives of helping the families to integrate into the area. We shared this with the donor and modified our approach to provide a combination of material goods with counseling, even though that meant fewer families served per day. It was a good lesson for us about the power of human interactions and the importance of following the wisdom and instincts of local partners, which is subsidiarity. Rights and responsibilities. One quick example of how we incorporate the principle of rights and responsibilities into our programs is our safeguarding policy. We work with vulnerable populations, and freedom from all types of abuse is an essential and fundamental right. Safeguarding those we work with is a critical responsibility for CRS, and we have a robust policy in place to protect project participants, partners, and staff from harassment or abuse, along with a clear system of reporting and response. We also require every partner we work with to have a safeguarding policy in place before we will sign an agreement or contract with them. We have 2,100 partners of diverse sizes and capacities, and we recognize that many may not have strong systems in place yet. So we make various technical resources available to our partners to help strengthen their capacities in this vital area because it's such a critical area of accountability. Subsidiarity. In Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict writes, "Subsidiarity respects personal dignity by recognizing in the person a subject who is always capable of giving something to others." Subsidiarity is infused throughout CRS's programs, including in our projects and structures, our partnerships, and our community-led programming. One example I can share is our increased emphasis on supporting our local partners to lead programs. especially in the health and emergency sectors, while CRS transitions to a sub-role or providing outside technical assistance. For example, in response to the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh, Caritas Bangladesh leads the programming response and receives funds directly from international donors. CRS provides technical support, but decisions and leadership rest with Caritas Bangladesh. We're working with smaller local partners as well to strengthen their capacity and enable leadership of projects, including directly from international donors. And we are quantitatively tracking these transitions to local leadership. Solidarity. I'm just looking at the time. Quoting again from Caritas in Veritate, the development of peoples depends above all on a recognition that the human race is a single family working together in true communion, not simply a group of subjects who happen to live side by side. Solidarity is fundamental to our approach, and one example is in our emergency programs, where we make sure to visit affected communities very soon after disasters have struck. We visit families, listen to their needs, provide relief materials. Often we're not able to meet all of a community's needs, but in addition to the material support, we offer solidarity by being there and accompanying them in their time of need and providing what we can. I apologize for the lettering. Option for the poor. So as I mentioned previously, one way that CRS operationalizes this principle is with our tools and processes to target the neediest and the unreached, both in emergency and in development programs. This can make our projects less cost-effective and sometimes even less successful. There are reasons these populations are unreached. They often live in geographically remote areas that are costly and time-consuming to reach. They often lack capital, not only financial capital, but also human capital and social capital. This can make strengthening livelihoods and other outcomes challenging. But this principle, and the Catholic social teaching behind it, does not call on us to implement easy programs that succeed quickly so we can demonstrate success and mobilize more funds. Rather, the principles calls on us to focus especially on the needs, the capacities, and the opportunities of those who are the worst off. A couple years ago, an officer from a donor agency visited one of our food security programs in Southern Africa. To reach the communities we were working with, the officer walked with the CRS team about 3 hours in the hot sun. At the end of the day, during the debriefing, he asked the team, "Why does CRS work in such hard-to-reach areas? Why don't you consider working a bit closer to the road?" Our team replied that it's because these communities are so hard to reach that we work with them. And they asked the donor, if we didn't have your resources to work here, what would conditions be for the people whom we met today? The final one I want to share is stewardship. Just briefly, one is financial stewardship, where we have systems both for CRS as well as for our local partners to ensure careful use of resources and to maximize resources going to those who need them. And the second way we apply stewardship is through care for creation. Inspired by Pope Francis and Laudato Si, we are working in multiple ways to care for creation. One, as a global organization internally, with 7,000 staff and 2,100 partners throughout the world, our operations have an impact on the environment. So we have established a climate action group that looks at our practices and identifies ways to minimize negative impacts on the environment. One more moment. I mentioned earlier that our new strategy aims to catalyze transformational change at scale. One of the areas we are committing technical and financial resources to scale is restoration of degraded land. This is a grave and worsening problem, and our emphasis is on reducing poverty and hunger among marginal farmers and other poor families who are dependent on land that has become degraded. In that way, this commitment combines stewardship of the environment with a weighted concern for the most vulnerable. In closing, Caritas in Veritate calls on us to pursue development goals that possess a more humane and humanizing value. Looking at the growing inequality in the world and the conditions and treatment of socially and economically marginalized individuals, ensuring a more humanizing value or more active recognition of others' humanity is indeed among the highest priorities for global development efforts. Putting our social teachings into practice through concrete policies, programs, and systems that uphold human dignity is one way we can respond to this call. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Castleman, for your contribution, and we hope that moving from the human dignity, the CRS program will increase around the world the integral human development. And we are moving to the Dr. Oni in response, please.
Thank you very much. In my contribution, I intend to look at the interaction between development theory and the two encyclicals, Caritas in Veritate and Populorum Progressio, and the extent to which we can learn anything from that interaction to inform the work of development agencies. Up to the early 1960s, when Hirschman's theory of unbalanced growth was dominant, a new development theory has been introduced after almost every decade. Development theory has advanced through income growth, basic needs, infrastructure development, poverty reduction, human development, and the MDGs to sustainable development, which are 17 goals and 169 targets that realistically can only be achieved with rapid economic reform and industrial modernization. In spite of this evolution, the poor, who are very often its main target, still do not participate effectively in the development process. Relevant to SDG 16, which is on social inclusiveness, one development theory argues that nations thrive when they develop inclusive economic and political institutions that promote democratic participation and social inclusiveness in order to give the poor different types of access. The poor do not consist only of those with incomes not sufficient to meet their minimum needs or are without employment. Especially from the perspectives of Catholic development agencies, they include populations fleeing wars, conflicts, violence, the breakdown of the economic and social order, and those suffering climatic changes that sometimes cause floods, earthquakes, and fires, among other calamities. When Pope Paul wrote Populorum Progressio in 1967, such conditions around the world, especially in Latin America and Africa, were fueling extreme poverty, while economic inequalities that were not being addressed through the development processes grew. In the face of much human suffering, he set out three main conditions for enhancing development. First, the provision of aid by the wealthiest nations and the promotion of solidarity with the developing countries. Second, the establishment of fair trading conditions between the poor and rich nations. And third, a focus on universal charity through building a more humane world community. It appears that the transition in development theory and practice has been inspired partly by the Church's focus on the poor and its teaching on human dignity. The principles of the SDGs relating to people, dignity, prosperity, justice, partnership, the planet, for example, are similar to the 6 main principles of Catholic social doctrine. Catholic development agencies are among institutions needed to effect development and should benefit from the Pope's first and third prescriptions concerning aid, solidarity, and universal charity. In dealing with populations bypassed by development, they may be guided by the practice of charity as further developed by Pope Benedict XVI in Caritas in Veritate, where he elevates charity to the level of a vocation in the practice of authentic development. He gives it a global and generational focus, indicating that it transcends the human person to all of humanity and creation. There is thus a human obligation to use the environment in a responsible way. In that context, it at the same time acts as an act of justice. In that context, it is also promoting the practice of justice. Aware of this, development agencies will hopefully emphasize justice more than their own generosity as they engage the poor. These teachings offer context, scope, and direction to Catholic development agencies as they deal with the environment and climate change and offer humanitarian assistance. It is a complex task to implement a development theory that seeks to maintain development indefinitely through inter- and intra-generational trade-offs. An indispensable precondition for progress, recognized by SDG 8, is the capacity to increase or sustain the productivity and output of a real economy in terms of all its sectors over time. If the cost of practicing a theory is not justified by this growth or is highly disproportionate to a country's resources, goals will neither be achieved nor actively pursued. Thus, in spite of the public displays of optimism and due to low economic performance and other challenges, not many developing countries make the high environmental and other investments assumed for the SDGs. Progress, in contrast to expectation, is low. There may be the scope for intervention by Catholic development agencies to reduce the burden of this slow development on poor people. When development involves support or aid that influences the flow of international and local resources into targeted sectors or programs, the original domestic development agenda may be altered. Furthermore, the perspectives of private sector organizations regarding sustainable development policies often differ from those of international agencies and governments. In such situations, the call of both encyclicals for solidarity with disadvantaged groups is one that makes Catholic development agencies ever more useful instruments. Their strategies need to continually align with the call to share wealth and solidarize with people in need. If efficient institutions can promote inclusive growth and thus bring the poor and vulnerable to the table of development, then Catholic development agencies should be ideally suited to this role. For, buried within the pages of Populorum Progressio and Caritas in Veritate lie the potential roots of their own unique development theory, fashioned to their mission of caring for poor and severely distressed people, with charity and distinct from the theories that have guided development. In other words, Catholic development agencies are in a position to promote authentic human development in charity, and they may well make that their mantra for work. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oni, even for to being on time. And we open the discussion according to the conditions previously indicated. And we have already a request for intervention, which will be made by Marta Isabella González Alvarez in Spanish. And after then, we open the discussion with all people, please.
Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Marta Isabel González. Soy la responsable de comunicación y prensa de CITSE, que es la red de organizaciones católicas, agencias católicas de desarrollo y justicia social. Trabajo en Bruselas, en Bélgica, pero he hecho esta aportación la he hecho en español. Espero ajustarme al tiempo, estoy súper nerviosa, espero cumplir el tiempo. Aunque llevo 20 años trabajando en comunicación, en organizaciones no gubernamentales, los últimos 8 años han sido en organizaciones católicas, decir antes de empezar, aunque ya he empezado a contar el tiempo, que esta aportación la hago sobre todo desde la fe, porque en general yo estoy en un entorno bastante ateo, yo creo que muy mezclada con el mundo de hoy, en la calle, la familia, los amigos, no todos son creyentes. Y tenía muchas ganas también de compartir lo que supone para mí como creyente y no solo como profesional de la comunicación en ONGs. Excelencias, señores y señores, ahora se cumplen 10 años de la publicación de esta maravillosa encíclica y como en nuestra vida de fe todo está entremezclado con nuestra propia vida, permitidme, por favor, que para explicar lo que en parte es Caritas en Veritate para las ONGs católicas de desarrollo, os cuente y comparta una historia personal. Y es que el año que viene también se cumplen 10 años de la defensa de mi tesis doctoral sobre comunicación para la solidaridad, en la que tuve la ocasión de estudiarla y trabajarla. Por eso, cuando desde CITSE, la red internacional que engloba 18 de las principales ONGs católicas para el desarrollo de Europa y Norteamérica, me propusieron ser su representante aquí hoy, no solo acepté contenta, sino que me sentí muy honrada, porque con el trabajo de esta encíclica y gracias a su análisis he aprendido 3 grandes enseñanzas que ahora quiero compartir. En primer lugar, después de leerla y haciéndome eco de la llamada en la que la encíclica recuerda que el desarrollo necesita cristianos con los brazos levantados hacia Dios, decidí dedicar la tercera parte del capítulo 3 de mi investigación a estudiar la aportación de la Iglesia Católica al sector de las ONGs y la necesaria revalorización del concepto caridad. Utilicé en esas 27 páginas un total de 13 referencias a la encíclica. Y es que en aquellos momentos, yo creo que también ahora en España, en el sector de las ONGs la palabra caridad está muy manoseada, muy desprestigiada. Y yo como comunicadora profesional en organizaciones de desarrollo, pero sobre todo como católica, no podía evitar sentir un pinchazo dentro cada vez que oía hablar de la palabra caridad como si fuera el peor concepto de asistencialismo. ¿Cómo no revalorizar la palabra caridad en el sector de las ONGs cuando toda ayuda, todo desarrollo, toda santa indignación ante las injusticias, los expolios, los acaparamientos de tierra, todas las pobrezas, toda el hambre, todo el sufrimiento de los refugiados y también de los desplazados a causa de la emergencia climática que vivimos? ¿Cómo no hablar de caridad cuando viendo las terribles consecuencias de las guerras, cuando toda búsqueda de una vida mejor para todos y cada uno de los seres humanos que viven en el mundo surge del que es el amor con mayúscula? No podemos ser indiferentes al sufrimiento. Nuestra única respuesta solo puede ser dedicarnos a dar nuestra vida por los demás. Como nos pidió Jesús, amaos como yo os he amado, y hacerlo con fidelidad a la verdad, que por cierto la verdad es también la máxima del buen periodista y comunicador. En segundo lugar, en mi afán personal y académico por profesionalizar el trabajo de las ONGs y el tercer sector, descubrí que, como casi siempre, Dios es el Dios de las sorpresas. Con Él las cosas son casi siempre del revés, a contracorriente, casi siempre de los órdenes establecidos en el mundo. Porque precisamente en esa época, además de desprestigiar el término de caridad en España, y ya digo también en otros lugares, se desprestigia el trabajo de los misioneros y misioneras como agentes de desarrollo. Se les considera como menos profesionales. Pero yo descubrí que la vocación cristiana, o dicho de otro modo, que el hecho de que hagas todo lo que haces por los demás, lo hagas por Dios, no te resta en absoluto profesionalidad. Al contrario. Pues son precisamente esos misioneros, religiosos y laicos, los que si hay guerras, epidemias y desastres no se van. Ellos y ellas son muchas veces los principales socios locales de las ONGs de desarrollo católicas, a veces también de las que no lo son. Pero es que además en su máxima sencillez suelen tener currículums y perfiles profesionales que dan mil vueltas a muchos de los cooperantes profesionales. No quiero yo hacer igual, desprestigiar a nadie, porque cada uno es quien es, ¿no? Pero ¿por qué ese afán de no aceptar a los misioneros como profesionales de la cooperación? ¿Solo por ser creyentes y vivir en coherencia su vocación? En tercer lugar, quizá lo más interesante fue que en esa época, hablábamos de esto en la comida, hace 10 años yo no solo investigaba la comunicación para la solidaridad, sino que trabajaba como ahora en comunicación en una ONG. En esos momentos la ONG no era católica. Estábamos liderando campañas de sensibilización sobre comercio justo, finanzas éticas y bueno, tratábamos también de hacer incidencia política para que se cambiaran las decisiones y se protegieran a las personas en la cadena de producción de ropa y de otros productos. Bueno, pues en esos momentos liderábamos una campaña sobre finanzas éticas para animar a que lo mismo que nadie quiere consumir productos que dañan el medio ambiente y la naturaleza, tampoco consumiéramos o tengamos cuentas bancarias en las que detrás de ciertos fondos de inversión puede haber a lo mejor armamento ilícito, clínicas abortistas, negocios contra el medio ambiente y los derechos humanos, cualquier cosa que vaya en contra de nuestra conciencia. Bueno, pues en ese momento se publica la encíclica y encuentro que hace una crítica feroz a ese sistema financiero inhumano y corrupto. Como católica no cabía en mí de gozo, pero cómo proponer a mis colegas de las ONGs que eran totalmente ateos una encíclica como documento de trabajo. Pues bien, porque recordémoslo, cada encíclica está dedicada no solamente a los católicos, sino a todos los hombres y mujeres de buena voluntad. Y ahí entramos todos. Me gustaría terminar, pero bueno. Solamente decir que para mí, personalmente, Caritas in Veritate supuso un aporte espectacular en mi vocación, que también está unida a Laudato Si, y que considero que las dos encíclicas forman parte de una misma moneda. Esto lo tengo que leer porque si no es imposible. Dos papas, dos caras de una única moneda, la Iglesia, que debemos seguir invirtiendo en el único banco y negocio que merece la pena, dar la vida por los demás, por los desfavorecidos, por un mundo mejor, porque el reino de Dios llegue de verdad a todas las personas del mundo. Gracias por vuestra paciencia. Lo tendréis escrito, o sea que así pues, lo podéis leer con más calma. Gracias.
Maybe it will be useful a suggestion for all of us. If we can speak slowly for translator, will be much better for them. Okay, please. Okay. We have two requests, Lei and Peter Schalm.
Hi, I'm Jadwiga from ICM, practitioner at ICMC Jordan. If I may, I'll do a small intervention that I've been really eager to share. So ICMC is International Catholic Migration Commission, working in the area of migration and refugee assistance. ICMC's mission is to protect and serve uprooted people,
Please.
including refugees.
Sorry, if you can speak slowly and not so close to the microphone.
Sure.
Perfect.
So our mission is to protect and serve uprooted people, including refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people, victims of human trafficking, and migrants, regardless of faith, race, ethnicity, or nationality. ICMC implements needs-first and right-based approaches so as to us to prioritize assistance to the most vulnerable people in need of protection. In line with Caritas in Veritate, we follow the call of His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI to continuously work to restore the dignity of people and inspire long-lasting change. In pursuing these goals, we make sure that all our programs and activities comply with Catholic social teaching, and integral human development is the overarching approach for all our programs. So what it looks like in practice is similar to what CRS has shared and Dr. Kasselman mentioned in his presentation, a life with dignity, where people are able to access basic services, including their social, political, and economic life. And this empowers people with confidence to make changes in their own lives. Just and peaceful relationships and social cohesion through our protection activities by addressing power, equality, conflict issues, people can feel safe within their family and community and actively engage in community activities. In Jordan context where I work, pre-existing socio-economic vulnerabilities of Jordanian population and Jordanian financial structures capacity have been significantly overburdened, and in the attempt to provide some assistance to the most vulnerable people, and it caused the tensions. Therefore, we work together with refugees and both with the host communities to safeguard both of them. As the world is evolving and looking broader on cultural, economical, ecological and issues like urban planning, ICMC is moving forward and inspired by Laudato Si, where His Holiness Pope Francis is calling for recognizing our common home, that we are a universal family and have shared responsibility for others. Developed nations are morally obliged to assist the most vulnerable in need. Thus, we as ICMC also work with Refugees Resettlement Program as an important protection tool for refugees and also for the internal responsibility sharing among states. Through our policy activities, we engage with civil society and organization, government, and international agencies, and also private sector, of course, to ensure that policies in protecting migrant workers, their families, are being developed and effectively implemented on the ground. We support sustained economic well-being and resilience, where people have access to resources necessary for life for themselves and their families. Therefore, we are trying to address and prevent dependency on aid and assistance. And in Jordan context, we offer both different trainings and employability skills to the people, particularly Syrians and Jordanians community, to build their capacity and successfully access income-generating activities and opportunities that result in less reliance on external assistance in the long run. So just a final word, I would like to share for Francis, let's listen to our neighbors so we respond to the many challenges of contemporary migration with generosity, promptness, wisdom, and foresight. So the people and our neighbors can develop and flourish. Thank you.
We have a lady on the right side on the third line. If you have a question, please. Yes.
Buenas tardes. Bueno, primero quiero agradecer por la oportunidad de estar acá. Escuchando sus aportes.
Sorry,
Sí.
don't speak very close to the microphone. It's a problem for the translator, okay?
Bien. Escuchando todos sus aportes, me acordé de las palabras de un poeta argentino que se llama Alejandro Croto, que leyendo a Simone Weil dice así: y esforzarse en ser bueno es tan inútil como tratar de levantarse tirándose del pelo para arriba, porque la voluntad no opera en el alma ningún bien, y solo en la alegría y el placer puede dar frutos del deseo. Tomando el rumbo que se señaló aquí, iluminado por el Sínodo de Amazonía, si el único camino posible para la Iglesia y para nuestra tierra es el de la ecología integral, donde está incluido el desarrollo humano integral, y si para ir hacia ese camino es necesaria una conversión integral, que es cultural, sinodal, pastoral y ecológica, entonces tal vez lo primero sea un encuentro hospitalario que pone al hombre en el centro y que reconoce la dignidad del otro como un don. El encuentro dialogal que va más allá de proponerse ser un ejemplo para otros o empeñarse en promocionar una mayor inversión. Y asimismo son lo que lo fundamenta. El encuentro, que es diálogo social, es el que genera la movilización interna y externa, personal e individual y a la vez comunitaria. El encuentro es lo que puede producir el gozo, es lo que moviliza verdaderamente el deseo y la creatividad y también la innovación para pensar nuevos caminos para un desarrollo humano integral. En ese sentido, creo que la Iglesia es un ámbito privilegiado de encuentro, porque ve a Cristo en los otros. Solo ese encuentro genera conversión y puede ponerlo todo en la proporción justa para dirigirnos hacia la promoción del verdadero desarrollo humano. Muchas gracias.
We can move to the Professor Schallenberg, who asked before. Yes.
Thank you. I have only a short question to Dr. Kastelmann. Thank you very much for your speech. Two short questions. The first question, you have spoken about the option for the poor. So no doubt about that, the poor of the globalized economy are the migrants. One group is are the migrants coming from, especially from Africa, Sub-Sahara and North Sahara, Maghreb to Europe. And the poorest are the non-migrants living alone in the countries there. So do you have experience with on the level of operating about just trade, world trade rules? Because that, I think, it's a very special problem, not only to solve the problem of migration, but to solve the problems of behind the migration. And then the second point, perhaps it's a little bit connecting to the speech of Dr. Gudenus before. You are also responsible for microfinance questions. And perhaps you can give 2 or 3 examples for microfinance projects, because I think it's connected also to the problem of impact investing, what we have thought about. Thank you.
Professor, please, you can answer, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Schallenberg, for the questions. Yes, I think as you pointed out, when we look at the poor and the most vulnerable, migrants certainly, and the speaker earlier pointed to this, are a very important and unfortunately growing community, as well as non-migrants. And in particular, what we find often is host communities in areas where migrants have moved are also often vulnerable. And that's an example where there are both economic issues as well as social cohesion issues. We're not working on world trade issues. What we are working on in terms of preventing migration are supporting, strengthening economic livelihood, strengthening social cohesion, strengthening services in communities. Even some of the climate change work is to help prevent migration. But I will say one of the things that we find, and I know this is happening in some of our programs in Uganda and Bangladesh and other areas, is it becomes very important to work not only with the migrants, but also with the host communities, and where possible to support integration, including economic integration between the two. And that's also to prevent, social and conflict between the two, and also recognizing that many of the host communities are themselves marginalized and can be negatively affected by influxes of migration. And so increasingly, this is something that we've been looking at, and I know in Bangladesh, the church has been quite aware of this and involved in making sure that the social implications of influxes of migrants are also addressed. Microfinance, yes. Catholic Relief Services, as well as many of our partners, do a lot of work in microfinance. Our primary approach has been savings and internal lending communities. We call that SILK, where it's small groups who save and then are lend to each other. And we've found one advantage of this approach is it does help us to reach the poorest of the poor. Often microfinance programs are reaching people with a little bit of capital, and that's great, and there are a lot of organizations as well as companies that do that. We want to make sure that the poorest of the poor are also reached and are able to move towards commercialization and towards micro-enterprise. So the savings and internal lending groups is one of the approaches we've taken. And we are also, and I know that the CASTRI has been very supportive and has taken a leadership role in this, and CRS has also been working in impact investing. And one of the areas we find is a gap where there's a need for impact investing is supporting micro and small enterprises, because oftentimes there is capital available for very small loans through microfinance, and of course for larger companies, because they're able to access the formal sector and larger banks, conventional banks. And looking at that missing middle of micro-enterprise is becoming an important approach to strengthening economic growth in poor rural areas. So this is, I think, a growing area for impact investing that we are looking at. Thank you very much for the questions.
If we have just questions, we can collect 3 of them, and then the speakers can answer to your question, please.
It is not a proper question, but also 2 remarks. Starting from our experience...
Please be short.
Yeah. The first is the multi-stakeholder approach. Today it's impossible for an NGO, in general, for an organization to work alone in the realization of the implementation of projects. It also is mandatory to work not only with other NGOs, but all the other stakeholders, private sector, local authorities, universities, because also in this way it's possible to reach the beneficiaries and especially to give them an hope. This is very important, considering that the SDGs are the platform through which it's possible to dialogue with all the stakeholders. This is mandatory, multi-stakeholder approach. The second, I wanted to underline the point that also my colleague from CRS has underlined about subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is a crucial point. As you know, probably in Africa, 50% of the services in health and education are provided by not-for-profit organizations. Most of them are faith-based organizations, so their role is essentially. On these regards, I want to offer some consideration about the role of faith-based organization. Faith-based organizations foster inclusiveness. No one is left behind as a faith-based organization interested in the destiny of the single person, always considered as a part of a community or a family. Faith-based organizations are able to include and involve not only beneficiaries, but also other partners. Proximity, a faith-based organization is close to the reality of the people. This grants the opportunity to understand their true needs, to identify them, and build a bridge between institutions or governments and the individuals, between policies and life on the field. A faith-based organization is able to recognize the relevance of the religious sense. There is not true development if we do not consider the importance of the religious belief of the beneficiaries and the implication of this belonging in their everyday life. Only a faith-based organization has the tools to act and take into account the role of the religion in the life of the person. A faith-based organization is a long-term investment to increase support and funding by governments and other stakeholders for faith-based organizations, considered as a partner in the promotion of a sustainable development according to SDGs. These are points that, according to me, according to our experience, very important because sometimes also the governments and the public donor, they don't underline in a proper way the importance, the role of the faith-based organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can have just questions, no more intervention, please. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Sasha Kuoshima from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, the Land and Water Division. I want to thank the speakers from the Catholic Development Agencies and also the previous speakers from the earlier sessions. At FAO, we do a lot of work in relation to the poor and the rural poor, recognizing agriculture plays an important role. And the partnership in inclusive growth is including gender recognition and youth are aspects in which we include in our projects. And I'd like to enhance and call for the agencies involved in the Catholic development for concerted action with all the partners, as mentioned earlier, of the multi-stakeholder process in relation to the land and water aspects of governance of natural resources in the space for protection, social protection, and rights in this space. So the concerted efforts are complementary, and I think the 8 principles outlined by CRS are complementary goals identified through our various programmatic approaches, as we may have different names for those. And in your work, I'd like to also mention the UN is going through a reform process at the country level. So when you operate in the country level projects, it would be nice to be linking up to other related efforts so that as you had mentioned about scaling up our concerted efforts and activities, it would be important. Another dimension is the working interactively on this policy messages. As we are currently entering into the G20 next year, where water will be highlighted as an important area, especially water scarcity that is dominating 2/3 of the world's water regions with water scarcity problems, and many others leading to migration issues, and particularly for agriculture and rural farmers in particular. I wanted to highlight water, which I think is embedded in earlier speeches, but not explicitly stated today so far in relation to climate change, in relation to land tenure. And water is a prerequisite for human survival and dignity, as you highlighted as the central point of your principles and the fundamental basis for the resilience of societies and the environment, and how it interlinks with all the different sectors of energy we heard earlier, but agriculture principally, which uses 70% of the freshwater resources, and overall the planetary security. So with that, I just wanted to enhance the role of water related to migration. Also, One Water, One Health initiative in human safety, as well as animal livestock safety. And maybe a question finally, is your microfinancing and all the impact investments related to the shocks. And the shocks are to be protective of hopefully the small scale farmers, which the rural livelihood depends the most. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all of you for questions and interventions. The time for the discussion is over, and leads us to close this fourth keynote address in order to open the fifth, which will focus on the perspective of Catholic social teaching. Next speaker is Professor Anna Rolands. She is a professor of Catholic social thought and practice at the University of Durham, UK. She is a lecturer in contemporary Catholic theology and deputy director of the Center for Catholic Studies at same university. She works with leading faith-based organizations, including Citizens UK, CAFOD, and Caritas Social Action Network. Our following as a respondent is Professor Michael Norton, Director of the Center for Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota, US. He is the director of the Center for Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas, where he holds the Koch Chair in Catholic Studies and is a full professor in the Department of Catholic Studies. Now we are moving forward to Professor Rolands, who will present the contribution of Caritas in Veritate in the sense of development in Catholic social transition. Please.
Thank you, Your Eminence, colleagues and friends. My paper now will be, in a sense, a response to two invitations from this morning. The first was issued by Cardinal Czerny, who suggested that we should be looking and thinking about the fruitfulness in Caritas in Veritate. And the second from Dr. Sachs, who talked about the need to open up the philosophical space that the document can hold open for us. I hope my paper will be focused on that first and second invitation. In the third paragraph of Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict makes a fundamental claim about the theological framing of the Church's body of social teaching. Truth, he teaches, grasps its meaning as gift, acceptance, and communion. It is not so much, therefore, that Caritas in Veritate proposes a vision of development as a discrete or separate humanitarian theme, but rather that the encyclical offers to the world a fundamental theological anthropology, a metaphysics of human development, through which the whole social question might be explored. In this paper, I will do four things. Firstly, I will consider key elements of this theological anthropology. Secondly, I will note how this understanding becomes distilled in Caritas in Veritate into a renewed, not a new, but a renewed definition of the common good. Thirdly, I will place this definition of the common good in the longer history of CST definitions of the common good, and I will conclude very briefly by suggesting why this renewed teaching on the common good is resonant for a church in dark times. The early paragraphs of Caritas in Veritate offer a vision of the human person, relational, interdependent, and orientated towards what I would call receptive truth. The truth that sets us free for a life of love is a truth we cannot ourselves produce, and its character is set as gratuity, mercy, and communion. This truth is no abstraction, for we know that love makes a very poor abstraction. It is found in the person of Jesus Christ and mediated through the Spirit. It is event, it is body, and it is community of practice. It is transcendent renewed promise that comes to us especially via its manifestation at the margins. This truth comes to us not only as an external reality acting upon us as a source of transformation, but also as what we come to know through paying attention to our own nature. We are created in love, made in the image of a truth that is relational, communicating, and can only be grasped through the operations of a concrete shared life. The social good of which Caritas in Veritate speaks is therefore not a scarce or a competitive good that is diminished or exhausted in its use, but rather a good that is increased in its use, which becomes abundant in its receiving and sharing. The task of the Church is therefore to proclaim this truth, to recognize it in its operation in history, to speak out against all that blocks this operation, and to be an agent in its reception and its increase. I would like to note very briefly four themes that Caritas in Veritate explores as part of this pathway of receptive gift and life in communion. Firstly, the encyclical notes that authentic development, quote, is not guaranteed by merely technical progress and relationships of utility, but by the potential of love that overcomes evil with good, opening up a pathway, and this is a quote we've heard several times today already, towards, quote, exchanges of consciences and of liberties. Secondly, this claim that we require an account of development as non-utility, of something which is beyond the language of use, is rooted in the notion that the developing human person is a unity of body and soul, possessing an origin in creative love and an eternal destiny for which this life prepares us. In this light, the encyclical proposes that to take human development seriously, societies require an account of both the material and the moral needs of human persons and communities. The moral needs of the person include the need to seek and to pursue this receptive truth, to engage in thought and reflection, to be able to participate in trust-based social relationships. How much of what we heard this morning from Dr. Sachs was about the collapse of those trust-based social relationships, to participate in the building of the res publica, in exchanges of civil communion that are capable of renewing our common life, to express and to receive solidarity. These are all moral needs of the human person. The person exists, therefore, in relation to a truth that is known and knowable, and it is this person in relation to a truth that is known and knowable who is the active subject of development, not its passive recipient. This vision of the good is therefore co-creative, communicative, and participatory. The good finds itself received and increased in a life that gathers. Poverty, by contrast, which is lack in all its forms, is all that isolates, shatters, and fragments. Thirdly, the text is quite clear that encounter between persons in an economy of gift is always, in its social reality, structural and institutional. And Laudato Si makes it clear that it is also ecological in character. This is precisely why the structures of economy, politics, and technology must themselves be shaped by the same logic that we've just been exploring, or else they become a threat to this fundamental nature. As such, the encyclical offers a whole social ethic of the conversion of institutions and persons. Writing of globalization, Pope Benedict teaches that globalization must be steered in relational terms. He defines this as communion and the sharing of goods, a person-based and community-orientated process and worldview of integration that is open to transcendence, close quote. We do this using a beautifully fluid image that Pope Benedict offers to us. We do it by weaving networks of charity. To do this requires that we turn on its head standard secular ways of thinking. Where we have imagined a life without limits, we need to refine an ethical framework that embraces limit and rejects excess. But where we have thought that we must be austere and competitive, we need to refine an ethics of abundance. Excess and abundance are not the same thing. And this is the fuller vision that is gathered in Laudato Si. And it is also, I think, the basis of the social movements currently taking to our streets. Fourthly, this vision of a reciprocal common life finds itself distilled in an expression, a new, renewed expression of the common good. Pope Benedict defines the common good as follows: to love someone is to desire that person's good and to take effective steps to secure it. Beside the good of the individual, there is a good that is linked to living in society, the common good. It's the good of all of us, made up of individuals, families, intermediate groups, who together constitute society. And he goes on in the definition to make clear that this good is an institutional good, that we need to find an institutional path of love. He finishes the quotation by saying this: "In an increasingly globalized society, the common good and the effort to obtain it cannot fail to assume the dimensions of the whole human family, that is to say, the community of peoples and nations, in such a way as to shape the earthly city in unity and peace, rendering it to some degree an anticipation and a prefiguration of the undivided city of God." This renewed definition of the common good should be interesting to us for two reasons. Firstly, because I think it reconnects us with an older pre-modern Christian common good tradition. And secondly, because I would argue that it anticipates language that is helpful for responding not only to the financial crash world that the document did respond to, but actually to an age of ecological destruction and growing populism. And I want to now briefly defend those two claims. Whilst not contradicting the well-known definition of the common good offered in Gaudium et Spes, Caritas in Veritate brings to this definition the grammar of the affective. It reintroduces the theological language of love and desire to our definitions of the common good. To understand why this renewed definition matters, it is worth spending a moment reminding ourselves of earlier Christian redefinitions of the classical idea of the common good. Whilst classical formulations of the common good focused on the good of the polis, of the city, either as an end in itself or as the means to express a more universal common good, early Christian treatments of the common good shifted the horizon of ends towards the transcendent. Early Christian authors decided on a more biblical account of the means that enable us to achieve, or more properly participate in, the true transcendent ends of the common good in this life. St. Paul uses the image of the body and its many parts, differently gifted, working together in a reciprocal fashion to express and to fashion unity in plurality. The bishops and teachers of the early church turned to Matthew 25 and suggested that the common good was constituted by the direct, embodied practices of mercy and love, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to release the prisoner, to tend the dying, and so forth. These are the bodily ways that we help one another upwards towards salvation. This was accompanied by a growing patristic tradition of reflection on the nature of economic exchanges, that wealth was meant for communal benefit, that wealth needed to flow with equity through a community and feed basic well-being as well as nurturing relationship. Material goods, like all other goods, are to be communicated through a communicating community. In the writings of the early church, the classic Greek emphasis on the common good as a matter of practical material well-being is maintained. Christian writers did not spiritualize the common good. They did not vacate the temporal or the bodily. Rather, they made a move in three parts. They set the Trinitarian reality as the origin and the end of the good. In this light, they insisted the good was something that we received and participated in rather than self-created. They insisted that salus, salvation, is a matter of bodily well-being and health as well as eternal destiny. As Henri de Lubac expressed this teaching, the Church's social teaching insists that our salvation is anticipated in time, and the patristic fathers insisted on a metaphysical reality for consideration of the common good, that there is a real historical struggle at the heart of our social life between good and evil. Evil as the will to power, as we heard this morning, as a radical lack and a refusal of the good. Evil is always an active refusal of the good. Gaudium et Spes did not repeat this whole tradition, but it did, I think, assume this broad anthropology. And to this, Pope Francis has added a more adequately cosmic account of the good, rooted categorically in the conditions of the care for our common home. What Caritas in Veritate does as part of this developing tradition is to return and to update the language of love and desire as the focus for a theological account of the common good. This matters for several reasons. Firstly, because it reconnects us with an earlier stream of thought that we maybe were in risk of losing. And the second is because we need it in our own times. In his mid-century writings, the German theologian Josef Pieper wrote on precisely this theme in ways that bear striking and dramatic comparison to Caritas in Veritate. In 1947, Pieper wrote that what differentiated a Christian account of the common good from its secular equivalents was its insistence on the importance of the non-utility of the good, not the irrelevance, but its non-utility. Pieper argues that when we think about the common good, we need to look at the sum total of a society's production, the whole of its output, material and moral. The good is as good as the sum of the total social whole. Pieper thinks we've got a tendency to reduce it to the idea of GDP or the usable goods of production. But Pieper says that a theological account of the good forces us to look at goods that are part of our common life, but not necessarily the goods that are marketable or immediately usable. Those non-utility goods are real and indispensable to the building of community. These goods are the ones that markets and states either wish to suppress or they wish to co-opt them because they disturb relationships of absolute power. It is the relations of care and love, contemplation and beauty that make our lives together and sustain life. These are the non-marketable goods, but goods that require communication, that make the world go round. They represent the life of freedom and gift exchange beyond mere supply and demand. They enable us to resist the total world of work. We find it very hard to speak together about these goods beyond the total world of work, beyond mere utility. It is this world of goods that cannot simply be put to use that Caritas in Veritate speaks of as the basis of its vision for development. But here, relating the question of the non-utile good to truth, Pieper adds two notes of caution. The first is that he notes that in relation to the truth, there are certain things that we can know about our lives together, the basic material goods that make our world go round, and those who are denied them. But he also thinks there is a necessary not knowing, a social apophasis about the final form of the good we strive for. He thinks that there are certain things we fundamentally cannot fully know about the common good that remains a horizon beyond us. And indeed, he is suspicious of any form of political power who attempts to tell us that they can simply know that truth fully, that there is an end or a closure to the social dialogue. Hence why Laudato Si on social dialogue is so important in resisting the absolute power that tries to totalize the good. A second note of caution, and I think this is so relevant to an age of populism, is that Pieper writes about the justice of power. Who has power? How is power distributed? I think one of the main reasons that we see the social movements we see now outside of institutional structures is that we have got badly wrong the question of the justice of the distribution of power. It's social inequality for sure, but it's also about distributive justice itself, a capacity not just to receive, but a capacity also to contribute to the building of the social whole. I'm going to move to my conclusion for reasons of time. From a Christian point of view, this is my view of the kind of final distillation of why I think Caritas and Veritate helps us now. From a Christian point of view, the good, like love itself, is always trying to communicate itself, always trying to make itself present, most especially in the context of its felt absence. It is word made flesh, a good that seeks to be known as truth manifesting itself amongst us. What is truly good is the opposite of all that seeks to obscure, to hide, to isolate, to make us unable to think and speak, and to fragment. It rejects the will to power in the name of Pentecost. As Pentecost, it drives us to risk speaking, communicating beyond boundaries about our deepest desires. And we know, as Caritas in Veritate tells us, that our deepest desires always are for love and for truth.
Thanks, Professor Rolands, for your contribution. And now we are moving to Professor Norton, next to Professor Rolands. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to do in this response is to highlight and I hope complement an important insight that Professor Roland provides, namely that we are in need of deep theological root system, which I suspect is the most enduring contribution of Caritas in Veritate. This theological root system can avoid abstraction and irrelevance if it is also, by the way, interdisciplinarily engaged. Theology should never just simply talk to itself. And it also has to be institutionally embodied. It has to be about action or move to action, something that Mr. Castleman and others have certainly talked about throughout this day. But I think all of these things in this theological root system can resist the overwhelming force in our culture, which Professor Roland's talked about. And she talked about it in terms of what Pieper talked about it in terms of a total work culture, a highly utilitarian view. This need for roots was noted by the French Jewish philosopher and political activist Simone Weil, who was asked in 1943 by the French resistance to prepare a text that would speak to the possibilities of rebuilding French society and for effecting a cultural regeneration once the Nazis had been defeated. The essay she wrote was eventually given the title, The Need for Roots. According to Weil, having roots is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. Consequently, uprootedness is one of the more dangerous diseases to which human societies are exposed to. For Weil, one poison that destroys the roots of a culture and consequently its capacity to develop its people is an education that has become disconnected from the deepest dimensions of the human person. She argued that educational practice can wither the roots of a culture when it is dominated by pragmatism and agnosticism to the transcendent, technical science, and specialization. This kind of education prioritizes the active over the contemplative, the technical over the moral and religious. It erodes the receptive and given nature of the world and creates the illusion that we are, as C.S. Lewis once wrote, the conditioners or man-molders of the world. This disorder of the active over the contemplative, the giving over the receiving, creates not a culture of deep roots, but of cut flowers. Once action is severed from contemplation, we lose our connection with our roots and replace what is primary with what is secondary. Cut flowers may look attractive for a while, but deprived of their nourishing sources that can give them life, they can flourish only for a brief time before they wither and die. For Benedict, we come to the profoundest sense of ourselves not through what we do, but through what we accept, not through what we achieve, but what we receive. Our development as human beings is found not only in our achievements, but also in relation to what we have accepted and received, especially in that receptivity where we can find the deep roots of what God is calling us to do. It is, by the way, why Benedict says this, that integral human development primarily is understood as a vocation. Caritas in Veritate defines charity as a love that is received and given. In the first words of the encyclical, he states, charity in truth is the principal driving force behind the authentic development of every person and of all humanity. He also indicates that charity is at the heart of the Church's social doctrine. Benedict is aware that this priority of charity will be misunderstood, probably in a similar way when Joseph Pieper published his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, and largely people said, nice idea, but largely irrelevant to the times at hand. In 1948, Pieper published his book on leisure in Germany, a country decimated by the Allies during World War II. This is a country that seemingly needs more work than leisure. Yet Pieper anticipated such objections. On the first page of the book, he writes, and I quote, "To build our house at this time implies not only securing survival, but also putting in order again our entire moral and intellectual heritage. And before any detailed planning along these lines can succeed, our new beginning, our refoundation, calls out immediately for a defense of leisure." Pieper was well aware of the Nazi slogan over the gate of Auschwitz and other concentration camps, Arbeit macht frei, the work sets us free. But work by itself does not make us free, but only enslaved to an ideology. What makes us free, Pieper argued, is not work but leisure, and not just any kind of leisure, but one that brings forth an attitude of the mind, a condition of the soul, that fosters a capacity to receive the reality of the world. For Benedict, charity is a central virtue for integral human development, since it calls upon the capacity to receive, which is the basis of our giving. Severed from the charity and truth, from the contemplative outlook, from this capacity to receive, we are tempted to isolate principles such as justice, the common good, inclusion, human rights from their life-giving sources. For these principles are an outcome of yet a deeper purpose, not the source of that purpose. This cause-outcome relationship was expressed in Václav Havel's critique of various international campaigns for human rights. Havel argued that apart from a connection to a deeper cultural reality, claims for human rights were always in danger of becoming mere slogans. He states, and I quote, "Politicians at international forums may reiterate 1,000 times that the basis of the New World Order will be respect for the universal rights, but it will mean nothing as long as its imperative does not derive from the respect for the miracle of being, the miracle of the universe, the miracle of nature, the miracle of our own existence. Only somebody who submits to the authority of a universal order and of creation, who values the right to be a part of it and a participant in it, can genuinely value himself and his neighbors and thus honor their rights as well." This miracle of being that Havel speaks about is a contemplative beholding that brings us to the fundamental recognition that life, nature, and the universe operates on the basis of gift that is first received, which is Benedict's main point in Caritas in Veritate. Havel recognized that a vague commitment to rights or ethics in general was prone to the cut flower syndrome, namely, it fails to nurture the roots of the moral life. Such isolated moral phrases might look attractive for a short time, but severed from their gifted reality expressed through cultural, religious, and spiritual roots, they inevitably wither, and along with it, human development. As Havel continued in his speech, such moral terms have no integrating force, no unified meaning, no true inner understanding to draw upon themselves to sustain themselves. They offer us a foundation for the imposing edifice of our social lives, only a platform of sand. So this charitable dynamic of receptivity and giving that Benedict proposes addresses the most profound dimension of our lives, of contemplation and action, of faith and reason, of the spiritual and material, the cultural and economic. So let me end with two implications of these theological roots that give us a distinctive sense of development. First, this idea of vocation. Because integral human development is primarily a vocation, as Benedict points out, one of the important works of the church is to help people see what Francis calls the nobility of their activity in relation to the institution they are part of. Our development takes place within institutions, and one of the works of the church is to see the implication of integral human development within institutions. The work of the dicastery of promoting integral human development is important here. The document of the vocation of the business leader, as well as other such projects, as the vocation of the agricultural leader, the vocation of the investor, and others, help practitioners to see the implications of a logic of gift in the institutions where they spend their lives. Too often, the church's teachings can be an abstraction, and people can't see its embodied character. One interesting note of history is that Pope Pius XII never wrote a social encyclical. But what he did do is welcome all sorts of associations and then gave them short talks that pointed to the implications of faith in the social teachings through their particular forms of work. The groups he talked to were extraordinarily diverse: bankers, public finance officials, Catholic Association of Employers, hotel workers, railroad engineers, farmers, petroleum leaders, movie producers, food producers, automobile executives, and by the way, my favorites: beekeepers, shoemakers, tramway workers, tailors, and book concessionaries of railroad stations of Italy. How's that for a list? What Pius XII did in these talks is to connect the social tradition of the church to people's particular fields of work, ennobling the importance of the work to the world. This becomes at the hit of human development. And secondly, the primacy of the receptive. Key to our integral human development is grasping a set of ordered relationships that go like this. We will never get giving right unless we get receiving right. We won't get work right unless we get leisure right. We won't get the economy or politics right unless we get the culture right. And we won't get Monday right unless we get Sunday right. Benedict speaks of the need of breathing space, of time and space, where consumption and production do not define us. What is desperately needed in our understanding of integral human development is the fundamental insight that we are not only made to work, but we are also made to rest, and in particularly to rest in and to worship God. And so again, the work of the church is to help people to see that the apex of their own human development is found in the profound integration of the worship and life of Sunday and Monday, of the contemplative and active life of leisure and work. If we fail to make these links, we will create false worship, which will result in false social arrangements, which will disorder our development, and these relationships are inextricably linked. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Noten, for your contribution as a respondent, and we open the discussion. Oh, too many people at the same time, please. Okay, we can start from Professor Becchetti and then on the cell line and go back. Okay.
Yes, I got inspiration from your speeches, and I was wondering where we should stay in this battle between populism and politically correct development. I think as with the Catholic social thought, we should be a little bit in the middle, in the sense that you said the root ties, identity are important for us. And so part of the populism to me is not just a revolt against inequality and material condition of middle class, low class, but it's also a revolt against a politically correct development culture that denies the importance of human and spiritual roots, ties and identity. Of course, we don't like the way it is expressed. So it's a revolt against the poor of sense development culture, or against the know-how without the know-why, or know-how with, I say. So I think we should be in the middle of this, and we shouldn't just take one side or the other, because we are in the middle with our culture and our roots.
Thank you for the very interesting remarks. You both spoke about institutions. Professor Naughton spoke about incorporating IHD in the institutions where people spend their lives. And Professor Rowlands, you referred to as part of Caritas and Veritate's approach to the common good, the institutional path of love. And I was wondering if either of you had any thoughts about what that looks like. I can understand, certainly from a development perspective, where we have health systems or schools or social welfare, and making sure those systems and processes are developed with Caritas as a founding spirit. But it sounds like you're both talking about something a bit broader in terms of institutions. So I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Can close the first turn with the lady on the second line, please.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I have two questions. One is about common good, and the other is about populisms. Because common goods always is an idea. I am theologian, I work along the world, and the people understand Pope Francis because, in my opinion, he put content to the common good. For him, common good is the 3T: earth, truth, and work. So my question is, what do you think about that? If we can speak about common good with these three ideas. And the second is about populisms, because populism is understood always like fascisms in Latin America. Populism sometimes is when the people is in the street claiming for rights, but sometimes is with the people, the poor people, is taking in functional for fascism's ideas, and in that case, the politicians speak about the truth. For example, Bolsonaro arrives to the government in Brazil from the theology of the prosperity. And theology of the prosperity is in all Latin America, but in the short time, like populisms, will be in Europe too. And in that case, they introduce in the camp, in the field of the politics, the idea of the truth and hide the idea of right and human rights and all the common good. So what do you think about that? Thank you.
Please, you can answer, then we can start
Sure.
again with another time. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you
sorry.
very much.
Sorry.
No, I appreciated your presentation, Anna, and you properly stressed the importance of common good, because one of the major confusion of thought today is common good and total good. And I don't know why people keep on confusing the two. Because total good is something, common good is something else. So it is proper what you said in your presentation, and I would subscribe to it. Now, what Michael Norton, yes, you correctly underlined that one of the key novelty of Caritas and Veritate is the introduction of the principle of gift as gratuitousness, not gratuity. Because gratuity was the wrong English translation at that time. Then it was corrected, because gratuity in English is something different from gratuitousness, as we know. The point is the following, that people are asking, but what does it imply, the acceptance of the principle of gift as gratuitous? It implies taking into consideration the principle of reciprocity. That is the key point, that unless we develop the principle of reciprocity, both theoretically and applied to actual service, people will never understand what does it mean gift, because that is a vague concept, because they confuse gift with donation. But donation is not gift. That is philanthropy. Philanthropy is not gift. The point is that we are lacking, and that is perhaps the purpose of the new wave of the Catholic social teaching, of translating that principle of gift into the principle of reciprocity, which is, as we know, an alternative, not in contrast, but is an alternative to the principle of exchange of equivalence. Everybody understands what does it mean, exchange of equivalence. But if we ask, in particular to economists, define the principle of reciprocity, no answer. Usually are sociologists or political scientists sometimes to talk about reciprocity in a very vague sense. It seems to me that it is time Why is that so? Because unless we clarify the principle of reciprocity, we will never understand the principle of subsidiarity. Because the principle of subsidiarity, it is usually interpreted in the vertical sense, but that is not subsidiarity. That is the point. Allowing the higher order agency to do what the lower order can do better, that is not subsidiarity. That is a distribution of power, you can call different way. Let me recall that the principle of subsidiarity in the sense of the Catholic social teaching was for the first time elaborated by a famous Franciscan, namely Bonaventura da Bagnoregio, who was the second St. Francis when he took the coordination, when at the end of the 13th century. There is an essay by Bonaventura Bagnoregio, who was teaching philosophy in those days in Paris at La Sorbonne, where he defined what does it mean, subsidiarity, even though he did not use the word subsidiarity. So what today is people use subsidiarity is not the proper in the sense of Catholic social teaching. You can give a different interpretation, but you cannot say that subsidiarity according to the Catholic social teaching is what is taken. And now, why is that so? Because unless we are able to translate in also operational terms the principle of reciprocity, we will never be able to allow the true principle of subsidiarity to take off. Do you agree? Thank you.
Okay, so let's deal with populism first. I think this is a really interesting question. So there were two different populism questions, one of which was the question about where should we be in all of this? Should we be somehow in the middle? That there is this teaching about rootedness and the desire for roots, that there's a driver of inequality, and then there was the observation that there is a kind of link between populism and fascism and a danger of a serious manipulation of the poor who seek rights. So taking those two together, my own view of this, and I work quite a lot on Brexit in the UK, would be as follows. I don't think there is a middle ground. I don't think such a thing exists. We're in an age of polarization. But nonetheless, what I do think is that the Church's social teaching gives us an ability to discern the presence of the good and the absence of the good. And we should be applying that logic of discernment very carefully to conversations around populism. So to make this concrete, in my own setting in the UK around Brexit, which has populist elements to it, I would make a distinction between the kind of goods that I hear people who voted for Brexit, and I think there are parallels in Hungary, in Italy, in France, and elsewhere. I hear the goods that people articulated that they voted in a populist direction for. We want stable communities, we want decent work, we want wages that allow us a proper life and leisure. We want a capacity to make a priority for our families and to be able to have a more settled existence. So indeed, Simone Weil's understanding of uprootedness, which is not just that there are people on the move, but that an entire culture of modernity, and she's writing this in 1943 in London as a refugee, that our entire modern culture is subject to the condition of uprootedness. And I think there is something in an element of a drive and attraction to populism that's trying to find a way to name that reality, that is trying to say we feel uprooted and we want to resist it, which is why the language of populism at one level is no. It's a resistance to something. But the problem is that that resistance, which in some ways is a resistance to something legitimate, is manipulated. And so the absence of leaders in our generation who can speak to genuine aspirations for the good that become distorted and manipulated into a politics of friend and enemy, into a sense of rivalry and competition, into a renewed logic of self-sovereignty, rather than the vision that Caritas and Veritate puts forward. We have to cry out and ask, first of all, where are the absent leaders and where there are movements that the church can attach itself to and be in support of and in solidarity with, and how do we call out those leaders who willfully distort the desire for the good in human beings. And I think, therefore, there is a distinction to be drawn between what we say to leaders of populist movements and what we say to the aspirations of some of those who are carried along within those movements. And I think our social teaching and a broad Augustinian Thomist approach to discerning goods in communities gives us a language and a capacity to do that. I think Pope Francis has tried to do that very clearly in his naming of populism as a spiritual malaise, that there is a sense in which what populism represents is this retreat from a capacity to see that everything is related and we are really all responsible for all. So that would be what I would say on populism. On institutions, very briefly, I think that the institutional path of love is about creating structures of the good, so structures of virtue. We talk about structures of sin. Where's the language for structural virtue? And I do think that Benedict tried to push us towards that language. I also worry, actually, there's a way in which we need to resist market logic in institutions, to respect contribution and participation, to make sure there's just distribution of power. All of that, to me, is obvious and true. But actually, those who are involved, going back to the populism question, in a deep attraction to populism are those who exist by and large outside of institutional structures. And we exist with a growing globalization of the institutionally excluded and marginalized. And those communities effectively have to create networks of solidarity in the face of a radical deficit of solidarity. And if populism is not being driven by that hunger for solidarity and the deficit of solidarity in its institutional and structural forms, then I don't know what it is.
I second that. Very good. Excellent ideas, particularly on particularly on the populism. I would say the one issue of popularism that we might want to, if we thought about every road has not one ditch but two ditches, populism being on one side of the ditch, maybe a cosmopolitanism on the other side. And I think a lot of people have felt somewhat abandoned. And I think this is sometimes the things that has driven the roots. There's lots of ways of manipulating popularism. There's a lot of ways of manipulating roots, which Professor Rowlands talked about, which I totally agree with. The question of institutions, Tony mentioned this question. I think it's a very important question. There's a man named Hugh Heckler in the United States. He is a professor of government. He wrote a very interesting book called On Thinking Institutionally. And what he points out particularly, and this is a particularly American problem, is that we think we can be happy outside of institutions, not through them. And thus we always see institutions as a burden. And the fact is, a lot of our institutions have failed people, and they certainly have failed our young. The church has failed it, families have failed it, right? Education has failed it. And thus, the one interesting phenomenon that's happening in the United States is the growing kind of attitude among the young for socialism, because they think the only institution they have left is the state. And so if we can't understand institutions in terms of generating goods, we have some serious problems. The family, in terms of its unitive and procreative good. The church, in terms of its goods. And in the document that we wrote with the Pontifical Council, with the dicastery on business, is the idea of three goods of an institution. Good goods, good work, good wealth. And those begin to define what the common good of an institution is. What is the common good of a family is very different than what a common good is of a business. If I may say, the family and the church serve as primary institutions because they are the places where our deepest identity is formed. Don't let a business form your identity. It will not be a great identity. And even the state should not form one's deepest identity. They do a poor job at it. They play a role in it. But the deepest identity is found in the deepest roots that will be found in the family and the church. And so I think the way we think of institutions as a whole and the multiplicity of them, and also the particular roles that they play, is very important. And it seems to me this is exactly what the Catholic social tradition is about. Stefano's point about subsidiarity and reciprocity, I couldn't agree more. There's a great Latin aphorism that goes like this: Nemo dat quod non habet. You cannot give what you do not have. And if you don't get a sense that there's something that's been gifted to you, and all you think about is in terms of the work that you do, your work will exhaust you. And by the way, at the end, and my last point, at the end of the day, there are only two kinds of people. There are those who are grateful and those who are resentful. And those who are resentful often think of life as a quid pro quo. What you put into life is what you get out of it. And which is what they find at the end of the day, they find themselves resentful for it. But those who are grateful recognize that they've been gifted something. And that's the logic of the gift, which is very different than the logic of the market and the logic of the contract. Why it's a fundamental way of thinking. It's the roots of the matter. How do you get to the roots of the matter?
No, we can start on this side. To be fair, we can collect some questions from the right side, and then we can move on the left side, please. We have just 10 minutes more, yeah.
I don't have a question. Actually, I have a very short presentation, but you can find front and back, one page outside, so you can read that. I would like only to say that one of the fruits of Caritas in Veritate, at least in my experience, was making me and a group of friends completely rethink our research. So we started from the statement that charity, in truth, is the principal driving force behind the authentic development of every person. And we said, this is a statement. Hence, we can put it to a test. We are economists, and in a group of interdisciplinary researchers, we put this statement to a test. So we started from exploring micro-relations, because as Mike was saying, we can learn to love by being loved, and we can learn to trust by being trusted, and especially extremely vulnerable people that are completely discarded by reality can only experience human development if they receive care. Care that means durable relations of love. So we started with this very simple anthropological premise, and we tested it in a number of different experiences of durable community care in prisons, rehab people, formerly addicted people in rehab, children's sponsorship for education in Africa, and so on. And we found some good results, and we also found some inconclusive results from the point of view of strictly empirical sophistication. But we are sure that this is the way. I know these are naive efforts at trying to follow Pope Benedict XVI invitation to search for a new trajectory of thinking. He says, thinking of this kind requires a deeper critical evaluation of the category of relation, Caritas in Veritate 53. So it's naive, but even in its naive form, this reflection has something to do about integral human development and also on global efforts at pursuing sustainable development goals. Because we have a list of goals and targets, and the list is a list, unless you know where to start. And integral human development and social development is to be understood as inherently relational, and the founding relation remains love and truth. More accurately, love and truth as a person to encounter. Thank you for your patience.
Professor, if we can have just question, not intervention, please. If we have not more questions, we can have just a break. And I will thank you, all of you, for your attention. And we have a break which will take just 30 minutes, and then we have to come back here. Thank you.